it's very bright up here. Hello, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 2023 Urban Forum. My name is Stacy Swearingen-White and I have the great honor of serving as the Dean of UIC's College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, or CUPPA. I am especially excited to be able to welcome you back to an in-person Urban Forum, the first time we've been able to do this since 2019. So for many years now, the Urban Forum has really served as a marquee event for CUPPA. It's a chance for us to engage our local communities in learning and conversation about critical issues that face not just Chicago, but other cities and urban areas across the world. CUPPA's mission is promoting just, resilient, and livable communities, and I'm delighted that we as a college have this opportunity to demonstrate our deep commitment to successful urban futures. Our two academic departments in CUPPA train our students to become leaders in their own communities. Our graduates tackle pressing urban problems with their expertise and also with a strong commitment to community engagement and creating shared visions for flourishing in place. Our 7 research centers and institutes deepen our knowledge of a huge range of global issues, ranging in scale from the local and individual to the global and organizational. So this is actually my first year here at UIC, and over this year, I have been continually amazed and impressed by the mission-driven work that happens in CUPPA. I hope that many of you in the room today will explore ways that you can connect with that work beyond this event. Today's panel and keynote sessions engage a really provocative question: can data deliver? And I'm going to leave it to our speakers to unpack this theme, but I do want to set a little bit of a stage today by asking you to think about and remember one thing, and that's that behind all data, be they big data, small data, somewhere in between, they're people. Real people living their lives that create data, people producing, gathering, analyzing, and making use of those data. And certainly the numbers and the information within those data are critical to a full understanding of urban issues. And it seems like our capacity for organizing and making sense of that data, that information, improves by the hour. Still, I hope we'll always keep hold of the fact that the people that are reflected in that data. And it's with that in mind that I think it's important just to spend a minute thanking the people who have worked so hard to bring this year's Urban Forum together and to you this year. So thank you to our sponsors, the good people of WBEZ Chicago and Vocalo Radio, as well as to CUPPA and our Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. Thank you to our Urban Forum Planning Committee, John Casey, Jessica Cortez, Brian Flood, Marty Gutierrez, Joe Horath, Norma Ramos, Haley Sanders, and Jenny Sweeney. Thank you to our 2 forum co-chairs, Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle and interim UIC Chancellor Javier Reyes. And thank you to the advisory board members whose names you can read in your program. And then last, I just want to give a special shout out to Jenny Sweeney, who is CUPPA's Director of Special Events Extraordinaire. She does all the behind the scenes work to make the Urban Forum and really every event come off seamlessly and incredibly. So if we could just take a minute to thank all of the people. We appreciate you. Thank you. And then finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joe Horath, Director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, or IPCE, which is one of CUPPA's research institutes, and Joe serves as the Urban Forum Program Director. This year's theme was Joe's brainchild, and he will say just a little bit about it and also go over the order of events for today and introduce our first panel. So again, welcome. Glad you're here. Have a great day.
Good morning. Thank you, Dean White. Before we get started, I would like to say land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the 3 fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region, at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trading, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, and Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city, and thriving still here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask, what can we do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence, and support indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty? Hello again, I'm Joe Horath, as Dean White introduced. I'm the program director for the Urban Forum and also the director of Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, and another welcome to you all for being here today to Urban Forum. Urban Forum is one of the many efforts we support that bring people together in discourse on current urban issues. As you heard Dean White mention, the theme for this year's Urban Forum is Can Data Deliver? Harnessing data-driven solutions for urban challenges. And we are at a pivotal moment where the advancements in technology of everything around us, together with the unfathomable amounts of information about the world around us, in cities where all activities, situations, incidents, conversations, and interactions are being turned into data in some way. What my colleague Federica Fusi, in her white paper for this event, referred to as the datafied city. My colleague Nebiyu Tilawan warns us also in his white paper that the ways in which big data was generated require scrutiny. Analysts should be aware of that it offers opportunities to find spurious associations. Algorithms that we set up may also be black boxes, and biases can creep in. So it's clear that the availability of vast amounts of data from and about cities offers great and really exciting potential to address urban challenges. However, we still have big and important questions to ask, and that's why we wanted to have this theme for this forum today. Before we turn to the panels, I'd like to just say this morning's agenda is pretty straightforward. We'll hear from our first panel. We'll take a brief break. Then the second panel, followed by our keynote speaker. I'll then give brief remarks to close out the program and open up lunch. So let's get started with panel one, which is titled The Potential for Data to Deliver. What is big data and how is it being used to shape our cities? The moderator for this first panel is Frederick Mitchell. Frederick Mitchell is the principal at Brightplum, Inc., a technology consulting firm that builds complex web publishing tools using Drupal for universities, nonprofits, and healthcare organizations. Brightplum has worked with Department of Justice, Stanford University, the American Hospital Association, and others to craft narratives around various data visualizations using customized authoring tools. I will now turn it over to Frederick to introduce the panel topic and our fantastic panelists to get the conversation started. Frederick.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Great. I'd love to introduce our panel so we can get started. First, we have Dr. Federica Fusi, Assistant Professor, Public Policy Management and Analytics at the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs here at UIC, where she teaches in the Civic Analytics program. Her research focuses on how public organizations can leverage digital tools to enhance their performance and improve outcomes for their communities, while minimizing the negative effects on their workforce. She also investigates the managerial challenges associated with the implementation of open data and data repositories in both the public sector and science. To her left, we have Nick Lucius. Nick is the Chief Technology Officer for the City of Chicago's Office of the Mayor. In his role, Nick brings data to the forefront of policy and decision-making for over 20 agencies and 2.7 million residents. His tenure has included responding to a global pandemic, ensuring an equitable economic recovery, and managing data strategy for an organization with a $16 billion annual budget. And to his left, we have Lori Merrill, Senior Analytics Engineer, Jarvis Innovations, and board member of Chi-Hacknight. Lori is a data and civic technology practitioner based in Chicago. Her specialty is in public transit data, particularly the General Transit Feed Specification open data format. Lori also serves on the board of Chi-Hacknight, Chicago's weekly event to build, share, and learn about civic technology. Can we welcome them this morning? All right, panel, let's get into it. So first, we're just going to level set. Each one of you can answer if you like. What is big data? And can you provide examples from your background, whether in government, research, or nonprofit, on how you're using it in your work?
I can start. So good morning, everyone. I am a social scientist. Part of my work is to investigate how governments, city or state governments, are using data to improve their delivery of public services, to better design policies, identify areas of interventions. But what is really important to me is not just what can we do with the data, but it's really how and why governments are leveraging data for the work they're doing. What I'm interested in understanding is somewhat what we could call the social ecosystem that surrounds data use. So really try to understand how different actors in the system perceive data, what values and beliefs they bring to the table, what social interaction come together among these actors so that we can share the data, exchange the data, and collaborate around data. So one of the projects that I'm currently doing really try to understand how community members, community organizations, but also governments and the public at large think about, for instance, environmental data to frame environmental justice problem and issues. So how different visualizations are interpreted by those actors, how these actors define the problem and so collect data differently, right? Because sometimes we think of data as a very technical matters, but to me there is a lot of social context that goes along with data use and sharing.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Frederick. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. I'm just really excited to be on this panel and with my esteemed panelists. It's a privilege to be here with this group and with all of you. Really excited to see you all here. Lots of familiar faces too, which is always nice. So when I, to the question, when I think about big data, I think about what I originally learned big data was an amount of data that's so big that you can't put it on one single computer and start working with it. Which really led to the development of a lot of different methodologies for hosting and storing and analyzing data across distributed systems. That's kind of my first reaction. But as time's gone on and we've learned how to grapple with huge amounts of data and develop ways to get insights out of it, I'm starting to think about big data in a different way where it's not what are the methods to analyze it, but more of what can you do when you amass that amount of data and it becomes so much and you have to start to create research questions. I think there's this new area that I think about with big data now that's not so much how do you do it, but what do you do with it? And then that creates a whole other sort of list of questions about the ways that you spend your resources and the questions that you decide to answer with the data. It's really easy to get overwhelmed with just vast amounts of access to data and the ability to do things with it. In my career at the city, I've experienced big data in a number of different ways. One data set that comes to mind is around mobility. We have vast amounts of data on everything from the Uber and Lyft trip or vehicles that you see out there, every trip that they've taken going back almost 10 years now. All our transit, micromobility, scooters and bike shares, and all these the methods of transit are generating data, and that creates a way to study the developing habits and also ways to move forward in the future. And a lot of the work is just to create ways of storing it and ensure that there's access able later for researchers without even knowing what kind of research it's going to be quite. And so, that's one big area. Another big area is around public safety. There's, public safety data has been an area the city's been working on for a really long time. One of the recent developments I've been involved in is an effort to change the lens on which we evaluate public safety data from, and I'll try to be quick about this deep dive, but from incidents of crimes over to the victims, and so it's a change of focus. And the numbers change when you look at crimes that way. You count up the number of incidents, that's one number. You count up the number of actual individual people who are affected and their social demographic makeup, and that leads to a different number. And it leads to a different way of researching the impacts and devising strategies around mitigation and building up people and helping them. So the question, what is big data, I think leads to a lot of interesting different data sets that we have at the city and that we work on. It's just a few.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Lori.
Hi. Hi, everyone. And like Nick, I'm honored to be here, excited to be here. I think when I was thinking about a definition of big data, I actually kind of came at it from the opposite perspective, not in terms of storage, but in terms of how it's produced. So one way I think about big data is that it's often being produced in automated ways, like by computers or by systems, as opposed to being hand curated in any way. So like every time that you pay for something, that's creating like a transaction record somewhere, and that's happening in an automated way that doesn't require like a human to sit down and say, so-and-so bought a coffee at this time, right? That's all happening kind of automatically. And so that's producing the vast amounts of data that require new ways of processing that Nick was talking about. And so it's kind of also not just how do we store and deal with that data on the back end, but that data is also being produced in a way that might be more automated and have less human involvement in how it's being created up front. So I think that's another way to look at big data. And in terms of how I use it in my work, I work primarily in public transit, and I'm a consultant on the California Integrated Travel Project, which is a very cool project in California that's trying to use data in innovative ways. And one of the things that we do is that we collect the real-time data for the entire state of California. So if you ever look on your phone and it's like, oh, a bus is coming in 5 minutes, and it shows the little bus, coming down the road, that's produced, like the transit agency is producing that data, and usually your map app is ingesting that. And we are collecting that data from across the state. And we're trying to leverage it in a couple of ways, which I think speaks also to the social dynamics around the data, in terms of one of the things that we try to do is analyze and report on the quality of that data and tell that back to the transit agencies themselves. So if it's like, hey, you're missing this field, and that's really important because that means that people can't actually use your data the way that you would hope, or hey, you're actually only publishing updates every 2 minutes, and that's not frequent enough to actually update riders while they're waiting for the bus. And that's we collect that data and try to help the transit agencies understand how that data is being used and how any issues with their data might impact riders. So that's an exciting way, because sometimes the agencies, often maybe that data is being produced by a vendor, and you're not going to necessarily re-ingest your own data. They're publishing it, they might think it's great, we've got it out there, and we can kind of say, oh, actually there might be issues that you're not aware of. So we're trying to leverage the data and kind of maybe some expanded computing capacity that the state would have relative to all these individual transit agencies and try to feed back into the ecosystem. But at the same time, with that big store of data that we have, we also do kind of some of that research and policy analysis to try to, improve transit service delivery kind of more from a policy perspective or from an urban planning perspective. And so I think that's how we can we're trying to kind of use a single data warehouse to feed multiple different initiatives and try to interact with multiple different stakeholder groups who might think of this data differently. And so I think that's one of the big things about big data is like, can you bring it together, synthesize it, and help it serve multiple different groups and keep people talking together, as opposed to just doing kind of like siloed analysis, or especially because it is difficult often to deal with the big data scale, trying to make sure that agencies or groups that have more capacity can try to have a good feedback loop with maybe the smaller agencies who wouldn't be able to do that in-house themselves. So those are some of the ways that we use big data with California in my job.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that. And I think, yeah, the big takeaway that I heard from all three of your answers is it's almost as if big data is this artifact that represents how we connect with each other and how we interact with the environment around us. And I think that kind of begs the question, especially with these, whether it's the amount, whether it's the analysis, or whether it's the context of, how does this fit in? One of the things that's sort of thrown around is this idea around open data standards and interoperability. Maybe and I'll start with you, Lori, can you maybe talk about what does that mean? What does open data standards mean, and why is that important to understand, especially the term interoperability? What does that mean?
Yeah, so open data standards are when basically a group of people in a data ecosystem come together and try to figure out a standardized way that you would publish that data. So it might include things like, here's the specific format, like we're gonna use, if you're publishing, for example, in our case, transit, the CTA, Metra, and PACE, they all have a schedule, and they all have different types of services, like PACE is buses, Metra is basically only trains, CTA has both. They all have different kinds of services, but they all want to be able to publish a schedule that riders can see in their apps. And like, if you're a rider, you ideally want to be able to use Google Maps, Apple Maps, Transit app to see all those schedules together. And so we're lucky in the transit world that we have a really great data specification that lets all these different agencies publish that information in the same way. And so there's stuff like, what format is the date? Like, that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, for us, a date is this. For us, like, how do you publish? What's the definition of a stop? And we've kind of defined, a stop is defined by, a latitude, a longitude, some other things. And so it gives like a way that all these agencies can publish, and you can download that data, and it's gonna have the same fields. They're gonna be formatted the same way. They're gonna mean the same thing. And we have a reference specification that you can go look at, and you can read it and you can understand. So the data specification is like defining how those things are structured so that different people in the ecosystem can interact with that data and know what it is without having to go look up, what's CTAs, what's Metras, they know what it is up front. And then interoperability is basically open data standards can facilitate interoperability, because interoperability would be when different applications or users can kind of interact in an automated way and can ingest one another's data to do different things. So potentially an app can download that data from CTA and show it in their app, and then maybe they can publish something else that's consumed by a downstream app, and you can have this kind of chain of different people or applications talking to each other. And so interoperability is great because ideally what it means is that you can plug out, unplug and plug in different parts of your data stack and have common ways to interact between layers. So that if you're publishing in ideally an open data standard, you can then ingest it downstream, and it doesn't matter if maybe I change from Macs to PCs, at some point, and now I'm publishing a totally different format. People may have experienced this with Gmail and Outlook or things like that, But if we have a common format, we can ideally link things up and that helps agencies avoid vendor lock-in, or it helps people have more flexibility to choose a product that works for them and know that it's going to work with all the different things they want it to work with.
Yeah, and I appreciate that very thorough definition. I'm on the kind of, no, that's great. It's really great. I was gonna say, I'm on the kind of end, my business is on the end, so when we're building things, you have no idea how complicated dates can be. There's tons of formats for dates, both local and international, so I really appreciate that. Do y'all want to chime in a little bit in terms of why those things are important, especially with the context of your work?
Yeah, definitely. I see. I think I see a lot of students in the room, and if you're interested in this, or you're here for data and you're wondering how can I establish a career in data, or you're thinking about getting into it, this conversation that just happened right here, I would really dial into it. You know, that there was a wonderful definition of standards, and you just heard someone who's got a business who is appreciating this kind of thing. And you know, I think it really shows how much potential there is for to create productive value and to solve a lot of problems once you get some of these standards things settled. You know, from my perspective, I'm gonna tell a quick story here, and I'll just say right out front, I don't know if it's true, but it sounds good, and it's what I learned. It's what I learned in school. I think I learned it in college. So you know, with Wikipedia these days, someone comes to tell me after it's not true, it's fine. But when the trains track was being laid in this country, and different operators of trains and different you know, companies were building their own tracks the way that worked for the locomotives that they had, and you know, there was not a set standardization. How far apart should the rails be? How thick should the rails be? And you know, we didn't have a network that was created all at once. It was created as a decentralized network at first, and at some point along the way, the people who had different interests and owned different companies realized that if they converged on a standard and they started to share the track, that they could all get a competitive advantage if they worked together and start to share. And so when those standards came about and there was more possibility for trains to go on different tracks that weren't owned by the different companies, everybody benefited from it. Or I shouldn't say everybody, because you know, these things are complicated, but there was you know, a mutual beneficial arrangement that came that made progress more possible. And so it's stories like that, however accurate it may be, that help me to understand how important standardization is, and that you know, once you start to work in standards, you start to see it more and more often. You know, like another one is cell phones and data, 3G, 4G, 5G. It always marvels me when I see a cell tower go up and I find out, like, you know, one company owns it, and all the different providers are all borrowing it, and then everybody's using the same, you know, the same kind of set of standards in order to all compete against each other and provide services to people who actually need them. When it comes to open data, I mean, I think there's, I'll be broad here. There's everything from the standards for what open data is. You know, is open data when it's automated and there's a public data portal and there's a policy in place for the government that says that all data should be open to the extent it can. You know, that's one set of standards just on what is open data. There's standards like Lori was talking about for individual types of open data. What are the fields? What are the you know, what are the agreements? And there's standards for how a government collects that data in the first place. Some of the open data that we have is not generated by the city. Look at COVID, for example. All those tests where we're putting out data on test results are coming from labs all over the place. People administering tests to a person in a lab, and you know, require standards just to be able to say, hey, all you hundreds of testing providers, you got to collect it in the same way, collect the same data, send it to the state all in the same way, so the state can send it to municipalities, and we can put it online for people to know what's happening on the ground in their local communities. And so that sprung up so many different organizations that oversee standards, and there's so much potential for more. I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg.
Great, and Dr. Fuso, I want to bring you into this conversation and kind of connect it to another idea. So as we sort of learned about these open standards and this interoperability and its importance, I'd love to get your perspective on, you know, this idea of sharing, right? Data sharing, how it relates to open government. What type of examples have you sort of seen maybe in your research where these ideas have been represented well, barriers, and especially with your opening remarks related to the context of the social impact? And as the dean mentioned earlier, you know, these are people at the end of the day.
Yes.
Maybe can you talk a little bit about, you know, what happens when those things work well, the sharing idea based on, you know, if there are agreements, and what happens when it doesn't, you know, on a broad perspective?
That's a very good question, because we talk, I mean, these were great presentation around what interoperability means, right? One of the main reasons why we need interoperability is data sharing, right? It's very difficult to share data if you cannot combine and integrate them so that you can actually analyze them all together or visualize them all together. And I just want to make a remark on what Nick was saying about first, the students, right? As a student, I think interoperability or lack of standards, it's something that you all experience. In my civic analytics class, I always get students telling me why I cannot easily merge those data sets together, right? Why I cannot do this project, right? So there is this idea that the more we can connect data together, right, the more we can analyze them. And the basis of interoperability, it's really a sharing cognitive understanding of the problem that we are analyzing. Nick was telling these interesting stories, and I can tell you there is a lot of research that back up the idea that once we all sit at the table and we decide on standards, we are much more likely to share the data and utilize those data. The data ecosystem that we study that are the most successful are the ones that look beyond some of these cognitive barriers and are able to bring actors together in deciding, right, how we are measuring things, how we're counting things, right? Because data standards are really an agreement on what is the problem of interest, which issues are we analyzing, like what data do we need to collect, right? So it's not just about technical questions on how we format the data, but a lot of these issues underscore bigger cognitive differences on how we perceive the problems, on what data are important to collect and should be in our data set. So I love when Laurie said that they are pointing out to agency what data they are not collecting or they're missing or that the frequencies that are collecting the data is not enough, right? Because some of these questions are perceived differently by actors. Like communities want some data that the government is not necessarily collecting. So agreeing on standards, right, means also to think about which data we want to collect so that we can easily share them and create values for all the stakeholders that are involved. And sharing happens much more easily when actors are able to understand the value of providing the data to someone else. There is so much effort in data collection and storage and analysis, right? And sometimes we kind of hang on to that. But sharing is much more incentivized when we kind of agree that by doing that, we can create more benefits and more value for the community. And I think there's been a lot of progress from the government side. Open government data, right, has been a successful initiatives. I can give you some numbers, right? If you look at major cities in the US, I would say that more than 95% of them has some type of data initiatives.
Okay.
But even when you look at the smaller one, we're still at like 65%, 70% of cities around 25,000 inhabitants having some type of open data initiative. So the idea of open government and openness has been a great success. So there is more and more sharing going on.
Okay. Okay, no, that's great. And I think what I sort of took away was, you know, the initiatives in terms of a technical piece, in terms of kind of putting these policies, that seems to be, you know, going in a positive direction. It sounds like some of the barriers around these kind of questions, the cognitive, you know, maybe blind spots that people have in terms of, you know, and I guess, you know, can you expound a little bit about how that ultimately, you know, shapes our cities? What happens when, you know, we don't address, you know, those particular things, and what can people who want to get involved with this, what kind of questions should they be asking to try to reveal some of those things?
So one thing that comes to mind, right, is that really the necessity to talk with multiple constituencies, right, about not only the data that are available, but also what data are missing, and what question do we want to answer with those data, right? So in that, I really agree with Nick that the question sometimes is really what to do with those data, like what questions do we want to answer? Okay. And is that question that needs to drive the way we analyze or represent the data? And sometimes some of the issues around data is also the lack of trust on how data have been collected by the government or they've been represented, or community, or lack of trust towards community data because they don't follow certain procedures or standards, right? So a lot of these are issues of interaction among these actors. And so I think like conversation and understanding the right questions can also solve some of these underlying trust issues.
That's great. And Laura, I want to bring you in here. So in your work, what kind of questions have you seen, and what some of the things have you found successful in terms of trying to address what Dr. Fuzzi is talking about, that trust piece, those other parts?
So maybe this is like a slightly shameless plug, but we had a really great Shy Hack Night presentation about this, which is free on YouTube. You can go find it, from Anthony Moser here in Chicago, who has built kind of a wrapper around the city data portal. And because his claim was kind of that the city data portal basically expects you can find a data set and you can do stuff with it. But his argument was that in his work, a lot of what he wants to do is find all the data that's available for a given, especially address, because he does a lot of environmental work and looking at facilities that have environmental impact. And so kind of to this point about trust, like he was like, the way that this data is being presented kind of already has an opinion, like that you would know how to find what data set you want and then go search within that, as opposed to kind of taking this perspective of what do you want to do with the data. I usually want to find something for all the address, so he built a tool that basically lets you search across data sets in the data portal to find a location. And I think that that's like a really great example of like, the claim that the way that data is being presented might not be in tune with the user's needs, but because of the way that the open data portal is built and the platform that it's built on, he is able to build this tool that fills the need. So it's kind of like sometimes there's this weakness in terms of data is being presented in a certain way with certain users in mind or not in mind. But if it's open, sometimes there's also capacity for those users to then go do the thing that they need to do anyway, or kind of like improve and enhance. So like I think it is this ecosystem of people interrelating and like building tools and then hopefully kind of like iterating towards better solutions. And there's this interplay between government and like activists and just like the community at large. So I think it's definitely challenging to kind of, people aren't going to get it right on the first try, but like hopefully when we have openness, like it does facilitate some of these, some of this process of kind of having that conversation and trying to, get to a better outcome collectively.
That's great. And Nick, I definitely want to hear from you. I mean, I think the big question I sort of have is, as you mentioned, the students out here, so when they want to interact with government, when they want to maybe address some of the things that have been brought up, changing the context of how to find things, especially with the resources that the government have. I mean, what is your recommendation in terms of the people who want to get involved? What questions should they be asking and engaging with? What kind of kind of capacity and maybe even background do you think best suits trying to solve some of these problems from your perspective and your experience?
Well, what I love about a project like Lori was just talking about with a Better Data Portal is that, first of all, that it's possible. And that, I think when you're working in government, you're faced with constrained resources and then a decision to make on this exact question of presentation, a decision on, what do you build, who do you build for, how do you understand who you're building for, what they need. At the end of the day, you usually have to make a set of decisions based on not full information, those constrained resources, and then also in folks' roles in government as a steward for the public. And once those decisions are made and products ship or websites are made, you always learn afterwards about ways that others' needs may have not been met, that there may have been needs that weren't known about. And when what's so great about a project like that is that there was the passion, capacity, skills, and an audience to make something and improve and share. And so that's a huge success when all those things come aligned, because it could be that need's out there, but we don't find out. And there wasn't a person with all that who decided to build it and then share it and then show what that need is. That could happen, and that's one of my fears, is that a Better Data Portal doesn't get built, and then we don't find what those features for searching across that we didn't know that people needed. That's why I really think it's also incumbent on officials and government to actually go out and actively reach out for feedback and understanding, and we're working on creating more venues for that. so that we're not sitting back and waiting for things to be built. We're actually actively user testing and having conversations with our users to better understand, where are we missing, where are the blind spots, and then we're not always going to be the ones that are able to build everything. There's always been a government role and then an external role. But the dance is figuring out where we can improve based on what we find out from people in the community. So I think to all of you out there, where to dig in, I'll just data.chicago.gov. That's the starting point for interacting with our data. Please reach out when go and build and create your things, but also reach out if you want to suggest something. We'll have a better, more easy way for you to reach out to us soon. But for now, reach out, email, say, hey, could you build this? Could you make this feature available?
Yeah, and I really resonate with that. I mean, it's funny, I've been in the tech industry for, the last 15, 16 years. And I remember back in the day, it was all about just trying to build things, kind of get things out there. And then as we sort of got used to our phones and technology kind of being all around us, there's a huge emphasis on user experience, right? And part of the user experience process is getting that feedback and constantly iterating. So what I'm sort of hearing from all three of you, from your different perspectives, is that just ask the questions and keep asking the questions, because the way it's built currently may be missing something from a cognitive bias perspective, from just an experience perspective, which is totally natural. But at the end of the day, right, if you keep asking those questions and maybe recontextualize how that data is presented, you could get new innovations out of it. And it sounds like, right, that the government also wants that feedback as well. And so, just constantly engaging and saying, at the end of the day, we want to keep iterating on this. This is what's important. So we have probably about maybe 5 or 6 minutes left, and this is my favorite question, so I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to answer it. So if you had a magic wand, right, magic wand question. If you had a magic wand, you want to change anything or implement a particular idea around open data, big data, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Dr. Fusey.
Well, I can be biased here as a researcher, but to me, if we were be able to seamlessly connect all the data sets out there, that would be just great. Because sometimes, right, we talk about interoperability since the beginning, right? But sometimes, like, the barriers for some of the analysis we try to make, or my students' projects, right, it's really connecting some of this data set at different level of analysis, at different units. You go from really micro level data where sometimes sociodemographic information is not available, or they're not connected in a way that makes sense, right? So you can get sociodemographic information, I don't know, at census tract or block group level, but not necessarily for an entire neighborhood, which makes much more sense for some of analysis. So I would say, like, interoperability, connecting to this data set, being able to easily move from one unit of analysis to the other would be my dream.
Okay, that's great. Nick, what about you?
Well, it's a good thing I don't have one, because everything we discussed so far today would be moot. It wouldn't matter, right? It wouldn't need standards. But it would be to, my dream would be that you go to the data portal and everything's there. All the data that the city collects, or that even our partners collect, that's important, that it's just automatically there. And to the extent, like, private, confidential data of residents is protected, but that you can get the most that you can get without compromising or causing harm through privacy leaks. And that, on top of that, that it's there in the ways that you need it, the moment that you need it.
Yeah.
Like every dashboard, every visualization is already ready, and you just go, oh, I have this idea. I wonder what the answer is, and then you're like looking through maps and graphs, and it's a complete dream. And you can't even describe it because it's impossible. But wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
I guess this is like not that magical. Maybe it's more easily feasible, but I think more flexibility for government to hire data and tech talent in a more flexible way. I think a challenge can be that, like, there aren't maybe data or technical professionals kind of embedded at different units. Maybe it's siloed in an IT department, or it's hard for them to get the technical job experience in job descriptions. Just like the way that hiring works can be challenging. And I think that would be a dream, would be to have to be able to have government have more technical and data capacity in-house, kind of dispersed throughout, so that I think that would help make that dream possible, because ideally you would have people kind of having kind of data warehousing and things that are a little bit more coherent and cohesive, as opposed to just like various tools that spit out something and you can put on the data portal and that's good, but like the common keying and all those kinds of things, you can't have that unless there's like the capacity to do that kind of data modeling work in-house to kind of connect that stuff. And that's where you get back to open data standards, because all these vendors publish things in different ways. It kind of all comes back together, but I think the way that you would get there would be data and technical talent in-house, in government, like good job titles, competitive pay, like good experience that people can get, and then we can do all the other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
That's very true.
That makes a lot of sense. So we want to open it up to Q&A. I think there's some microphones. Yep, some people standing out. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and I'll just call on you, and then we'll get some questions answered. So we got a young man in the back right here. Please introduce yourself, and yeah.
My name is Uri Wolfson, professor of computer science. And my question is, what would be some novel applications that are enabled by the big data that you're talking about that weren't available 5 or 10 years ago?
So anyone jump in on that one?
I mean, the transit stuff, it has come so far. I mean, you can look at your phone and go look and when's the next number 8 bus gonna come, and I think that wasn't, and the coverage that we have now in terms of operator, like it's not, I think that's the other thing, is big data isn't always like, you know, like the robot dog or some really it's like, it might just be, I know when the bus is gonna come, and like, and making that data more and more trustworthy is you know, important, but like, I think sometimes it is just kind of making existing government services run smoother, be more accessible, you know, and so it's not always gonna be something that seems super high tech, but like, the fact that so many transit operators publish their schedule, and like you can take the bus in like Rockford, Illinois, you can take it in Chicago, you can take it in New York, and they're all publishing their data the same. Like, I think that that's a cool big data application. Yeah. I'm biased, but.
No, absolutely. And I think just to piggyback off that a little bit, especially speaking to what Dr. Fusey talked about, you know, different people have different lived experiences, but part of the thing that connects us together is being able to plan our days, being able to get to where we need to go on time, because that has a ripple effect on a lot of different things, right? If I can't get to my job, if I can't, you know, call in sick, or if I can't redirect, then that may have a ripple effect in how I support my family, how I think about my own sort of, you know, happiness. So having publicly available data where, from a transit perspective, you know, I can now navigate things, I think is really important. So, but go ahead, yeah.
But I would say it's also just more than like access to the public services or like planning your life. You can advocate for policy, right? If there is like, I'm just citing Lori and this Ghost Buses project, right? Like, but if you know that there are some bus line that are never on time, where the bus doesn't come and you cannot get to work, right? These are problems that cities need to address. So it's not just about planning your life and public services, but it's also policy advocate. I'm doing some research on environmental data, so like the capacity that we have now to measure air quality, for instance, with automated vehicles that move around neighborhoods and capture real-time data. That's another example of having better data so that communities can advocate for policy change.
No, that's powerful. Did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think one that I'll add is, you know, just take streetlights, for example. It wasn't that too long ago that in order to know if a light, you know, to confirm that a light was actually out, someone had to drive over the light, take a look at it, and that there was absolutely no other way. You know, into where we are today, where all those streetlights are connected, you know, through the internet. So there's an ability to go in and check and see if, you know, are they all out? Is there one out? And to respond to what's going on without having to drive all over the city, at least not at the outset. So I think that's one example of a big change. Another real quick one is. Kind of in line with the transit example, is the ability to put in a city services request through 311, and now you can find out how long those typically take based on the actual data for how long it takes to complete those requests, and you know, that's kind of constantly updating to try to reflect what your actual experience would be. So it's, you know, I think you're right. There are a lot of examples just kind of at the edge of they're not these huge life-changing things, but they're these things that just make you able to predict your life a little better and expect what's coming.
And in addition to what Dr. Fuse said, and if there's something that's missing, right, give you that leverage and avenue to advocate for a different change of policy. Next question. Any other questions? I thought I saw another hand in the yellow back here.
Hi there. My name's Cliff. I'm with the Illinois Housing Development Authority. And you guys were talking about issues surrounding interoperability with data. And I think we're at the advent of deploying AI and large language models to kind of take care of some of those issues. And I wonder if you guys have any experience or if you guys have been talking about deploying those sorts of solutions to look at those issues.
Yeah, I can jump in. LLMs, generative AI is, I think not only are we looking at it, but it's like everybody is looking at it, even people who don't work in IT and tech right now. And I think that's really exciting because the more, I think the more consumer level driven that technology is, the more we can have a common language around it right away. So often when it comes to technology features, I feel like there's the layperson and there's those that are really involved in tech, and there can be a gap. But what I'm noticing with generative AI right now is that it's out in the conversation, and people can really be on even setting, and everyone's reading about it. And I think where I'm really excited about its potential is in helping people who are already doing tasks, do some of those tasks that just take a lot of time faster, and then opening up those people to being able to do more of what they do best. To give examples, a lot of people have to take really long documents and summarize them. A lot of people have to take events like this, and here we are talking for an hour. We've said a lot, and write up. Okay, so what happened? I don't think I don't think that these tools just replace or do all that work. I think they really help people get started, and it's almost like I think of when you're using Photoshop or you're using some creative tool, and there's AI in it that will help you and nudge you and take that block that you're putting and center it the way that you want to center it, where if you had to do it, it would take you all this time, you'd get really frustrated. And I think there's just a lot of, again, to the other point of little edge cases and things that just kind of make life a little easier. I think there's a lot of what generative AI is going to be able to do with that. I think that if we're looking at wholesale replacing certain activities, I would fear that that's not going to happen. It's not going to do it well, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. And so I'm not advocating for that, but I am really excited about just, again, with a lot of this stuff, just how it can make life a little easier in some cases.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead. Yeah.
I guess I think that we always should large language models and generative AI are not different than any other technology, and we have to ask the same questions we would always ask in terms of what's the impact, how was it built, who was it built by, and for what purpose. And I think we've talked a lot about open data. I think one of the biggest challenges with LLMs is that the training data is often not very obvious. There's a lot of concern about the how was it built and what went into it. I think there's all this stuff about copyright as just one case of if they're potentially going to reproduce copyrighted materials, are they going to intellectual property? I think that's one angle. I think there's a lot to it's a kind of a hype thing right now, and I hope people kind of can think a little bit about the same things. Because just in the housing example, there was an investigation recently in LA that they had a prioritization score that they would give people who were seeking housing. And it wasn't an LLM, it was just a normal, I think, scoring or algorithm thing. And they found that it had racial bias, right? And that I think Black applicants were less likely to be prioritized or shown as very high risk in need of housing. And so I think we always just need to be asking those questions to make sure that it's being applied responsibly, and that people understand the impacts, and that we're thinking about that very carefully. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say to speak to the question as well. I think one of the things, at least from my work, that I'm seeing, where Slaughter talks about, what Dr. Fuse was saying, is that one of the potential big advantages is the barrier to entry to interrogate, right? The whole goal, I think, in a kind of perfect world, is that anyone can put a prompt to something that's supposed to be trained on understanding the context of that prompt to basically maybe decipher or provide a nudge or a shortcut to something that may be very dense or something that requires like a level of expertise to really kind of get in the details. I'm thinking in my magic wand scenario, right, where someone can advocate, you know, and wants to advocate for particular policy change, but because the meat of what's going on is kind of dense within these kind of really big data pieces, AI may be able to help that person or that constituency based on the prompts that they ask it, sort of tease out some of those details to then say, okay, well, based on this analysis or summary of what's going on, you know, when it's summarized, whatever is going on, I can now sort of have a little bit more information to advocate for myself, advocate for my community, and approach maybe leadership and things of that nature, again, in a perfect world. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I appreciate, did you have anything you want to add to that, or?
Maybe just one thing that connects some of the topics that have been emerging towards the end, right? But one thing about artificial intelligence is to ask those questions, right? Meaning also for governments, agency, for instance, to have the capacity and talents that are able to supervise the application of artificial intelligence. Because I do agree, right? There is a lot of questions about training data and biases that might be embedded in algorithms. And so we need to have also the in-house skills, right? To make sure that the principle upon which government relies are actually translated into the way we utilize artificial intelligence.
I think it's a really good point, yeah. Another question. Sir in the back.
Excellent panel. My name is Raj Shah. I'm at Rush University in the Center for Community Health Equity. So I was just kind of curious if you could give us, from your perspective, where we are in the Chicago region compared to other places around the country or internationally in allowing for open data access from government sources to, you know, address these chronic urban problems that we're dealing with. Where would you put us, like as leaders, as sort of followers, as people who are catching up?
That's a great question. Who wants to jump in?
Let me first.
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I may be biased. I think we're up there. I think we're a model. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I hear, I'm going to speak, about municipalities, governments, comparable governments, because we talk a lot, we share a lot. And the City of Chicago's program, we have a absolutely wonderful program manager and team that runs the Open Data Portal, and they put a premium on usability, explainability, well-documented metadata. And there's different ways that you could go about an open data program. You could focus on just like getting as much data out there without a whole lot of context and without a whole lot of clean metadata and attention. You can focus on making the most perfect metadata and the most usable documented data sets that you can. And I think Chicago's approach is to try to find the right balance of getting as much out there as we can, but making sure that what goes out there is useful, and highly evaluate automation because the data will be stale immediately after the day after it's out there. And I think that there's a lot of great governments out there doing things that we can learn from as well. But that's my biased take, and I would love to hear what the person who studies this for a living has to say.
Well, not just because Nick is here, but I do agree that Chicago is doing very well. There is a lot of cities in the US that I think are doing very well. I mentioned it before, right? Open government data, the idea of openness in government, it's been a successful concept with a lot of governments jumping onto that. And there are some cities that are leading, meaning that they're doing more, or to me, the important part of some of the cities is that they're asking the big question, right? What does it mean to share the data? How do we make them more user-friendly? How we make them even more equitable, right? How we can guarantee access across the population. And I think Chicago is one of the cities that is asking this type of question. So I would say they're doing great.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, a prior job, I actually had to do like I had to go to city data portals for a bunch of different municipalities and counties and states looking for transit and traffic kind of related data. And Chicago objectively publishes a lot of data that other places don't. I mean, we're lucky that we're a big city and And I think we were early adopters of some of the open data stuff, which is great. But I guess I would also give a plug to, I think, part of what Chicago benefits from is that we do have a strong civic tech community. Like Chi-Hack Night's been around for 10 years. I think that that's like important to have that interlocutor and have that kind of like community. And we also have a lot of great journalism in Chicago. We have a lot of people doing data-driven journalism. ProPublica did their big thing about the traffic tickets. They published their database that I think they had to FOIA for. I don't know, but they published a database of traffic tickets. And so I think it's not, like the city's done a lot of great work, and we also have this ecosystem of other people participating, which makes it stronger and which makes it better, and hopefully it is used also for accountability. So I do think Chicago's in a really good position.
That's awesome. One more question, okay. Young man, he had his hand up, so we'll go with him right here in the front.
Thank you. Do you guys ever worry about like a misuse of data in any way? You're talking about like how there's a lot of curiosity in the public as to how these systems work, but I still think that there's a big knowledge gap between the people at the top who really understand these systems and then everyday people who, I mean, we literally just use our phones and we don't really even understand how algorithms and data is being used like to sell different products all the time. So how do you kind of address that, and how do you make sure that the public actually has the skills to keep people who are making these decisions in check?
That's a great question, yeah.
I think that's a fantastic question, and there's a couple of different ways I think about it. First I'll say back to that open data question. I feel very fortunate to have come into this job with an open data program that was already established, already first class, and already out there, because the people who started it had to grapple with that question in a way that there was a precedent for. To create this, I'm sure there were people saying, you can't do it, you're going to cause harm, people are going to misuse the data, and they had to hope and feel that they were doing the right thing, but they didn't have the precedent. And now we have the ability to look and have all these data sets, and when we go do a new one, we can look at a comparable one and see what happened when we put that one out. But I think there's misuse in the way that you put information out there, and it can become something that people can misuse for harm just by virtue of existing. And I think that in working in government, it's one of the things that it's that moving the needle towards transparency and accountability, that narrative of putting it out there could cause misuse is a narrative against transportation or transparency sometimes. And so a lot of times we have to hear that and look at it and evaluate it, but also make sure that those fears don't become the reason to not put the information out there. But then where I think it becomes very vital is when we're talking about putting data that could be used to identify someone, or that could be used to reverse identify someone and attribute some behavior or some experience or some lived condition that they experience with that person. And those are times when these people didn't consent to the fact that they filled out some government form and we put aggregate statistics out there, and someone might be able to figure out, aha, now I know this information about these people. And it's impossible to know all the different ways that this might be able to be used. And I know we're running short on time, but I'll say that's why it's really important to really vet this stuff, to have lots of different people look at it, and to listen to the community when data goes out to see how we strike this balance. It's always an ongoing concern.
Did you want to add to that?
Maybe just a couple of things. One, it's true that the fear of misuse was one of the main reasons at the very beginning government agencies did not want to share the data. And it's still a fear that even as researchers we have when we release data. So I think it's very common. Is people are getting more and more used to have their data public, and they see that nothing really happens. And in most of the cases, the data create more benefits. And I think the right question at this point is not really the misuse, but the harm. Right? The only reason maybe not to release the data set is when they have a very likelihood to cause more harm than benefits. And so we're going back to the possibility to identify people in data set that did not give consensus to use their personal information. So I think the question now is not anymore about the misuse, but it's mostly about the harm that data could create for individuals. And I think that's the real scale that you need to evaluate.
And I think ideally we would have more kind of governance and standards about those evaluations, because I think obviously we're kind of talking about government data, but a lot of harmful data practices are done in the private sector, right? And there's less visibility into that. And I think that's why I think it's so important to build technical capacity in government and also to build literacy in the general population at large, because we do want to kind of hold also private corporations accountable for what they do with data. And I think I think it also goes back to just basic education and trying to figure out how to ways to kind of teach, start thinking about how do we update literally education in K through 12 to help, this is the world we live in now. We all as a society should be thinking a lot more about how is data used? What does it mean? Why am I seeing this Instagram ad? But it comes back because it's how do they know that I'm interested in shoes? With these shoes, and you've seen some harmful data stuff in kind of ad targeting, things like that aren't related to government, but ideally government might have a regulatory role to help protect people or help people understand that, so.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and I'll just end on, the simple answer that I sort of come to is just right to privacy, right? Find if you mentioned about the layman versus kind of, is there a possibility that, we can sort of drive towards the right to privacy, the right to be forgotten, things of that nature to try to help from an individual perspective. That's people have asked. So I want to give thanks to our panel and thank you again for your attention. Appreciate it.